What gang won Chicago? Well, Trap Lou Raw Clips said his ass know what run Chicago, and he made a video on the shit on the most ruthless gangs that run Chicago. Now, I'm from Chicago, the east side, you feel me? Not even for commercial, big orange building. That's where I resided at until they kicked everybody out the building and shit. So, I know about Chicago, and I'm finna see what the fuck you talking about and shit. We finna like this video. We finna get into it.
Over the last 10 years of drill music, Chicago has gained a reputation as a dangerous city, infested with gangs with danger lurking on every street corner. If the music's to be believed, the city is a literal war zone, hence it earning the menacing nickname Chirac. However, gang culture in Chicago is nothing new, despite drill music making...
No one calls Chicago Chirac no more. If you say Chirac, bro, motherfuckers gonna think your ass is the lame, bro. A certified goofy. Ain't nobody saying no motherfucking Chirac. I'm telling you this right now.
Making it famous over the last 10 years, for decades, gangs have controlled the corners, projects, and neighborhoods all over the city. And the wars between these gangs vying for control of these areas have taken countless lives. The original gangs that formed in Chicago in the late 60s and 70s were passed down from generation to generation. And while the modern-day gangs of Chicago are less organized than their predecessors, the younger members always seem to pay homage to their ancestors. Drill music...
Less organized? Nigga, way less organized, my boy. Like, the organization compared to back then, compared to now, completely different, bro. 100%.
It has popularized modern gangs in Chicago like 600, as well as O Block, Lamron, 300, and No Limit, just to name a few. But what all of these gangs...
I don't think O Block is a gang. I mean, I guess O Block. Nah, I don't think O Block is a gang for real. O Block is a neighborhood. But I mean, I guess O Block is a gang. Shit, I'm not finna get here and tell motherfuckers what they is and what they ain't.
Gangs have in common is that they're typically not larger than, say, a few dozen members, and their territories no larger than just a few blocks, and their rival gangs are often no further than just one or...
Well, if y'all want to know where I lived at, I used to stay right here on South Shore, and I used to stay on motherfucking Commercial. Commercial would be somewhere down, like, around in this area, I believe. I don't really know for sure looking at this map, because I can't really see. But I lived on South Shore. I used to live on 76 and South Shore, right by Rainbow Beach. You feel me? But I grew up on Commercial, not even Commercial. But I grew up in this area, far over here, far over east by the lake.
2 blocks away from them. And despite having a new identity formed around their native area, like O Block, for example, these new school gangs will often have ancestral connections to more historic and famous street gangs from back in the day, with O Block generally being made up of members of Black disciple heritage. No Limit, for example, is made up of members with OGs that repped the Black P Stone Nation, and so on. According to some estimates, there are over 100 such gangs in the Chicago area, with an estimated combined membership of about 150,000 individuals, which means that over 5% of Chicagoans may actually belong to a gang. And the state of Illinois as a whole has the highest rate of gang membership per capita compared to any other state in America. These factors...
Yeah, everybody be gang banging. It's like niggas don't be gang banging for real, but it's like, nigga, you from over there, that's what you is. And that's how it just damn that be. You feel me? But niggas don't be gang banging, but they be gang banging. It's like everybody be gang banging. At the same time, everybody not gang banging. It's hard to explain.
Make the modern-day gang wars of Chicago seem incredibly chaotic and senseless. And ever since 2012, when Chief Keef first brought drill music to the world's attention, Chicago has been a city with the highest number of total homicides in America, as well as having the highest number of homicides per capita amongst the 20 largest cities in America. In fact, Chicago recorded more homicides than New York and Los Angeles combined in the years between 2016 and 2018. But while the violence has arguably always been a part of Chicago, the gangs weren't always this fractured. During the late 50s to the early 70s, several major African-American-based gangs were founded in Chicago, primarily in the south and west sides of the city, with these gangs standing out as some of the largest and most highly organized gangs in American history. These groups included names like the Black Souls, the Four Corner Hustlers, the New Breeds, and the Vice Lords, all of whom operated particularly on the west side of the city.
Yeah.
And the Black Disciples, Gangster Disciples, Black P Stones, and Mickey Cobras who were all primarily on the south side. Since the 1960s, the leaders of these gangs established their organizations as expansive, cross-neighborhood gangs and nations with hierarchical structures, meaning that back in the day, the local factions of these gangs all operated under the authority of a central leadership body, which held significant power in setting the gang's policies, maintaining discipline, promoting members, and overseeing conflicts with rival gangs. Originally, these gangs...
You see, I couldn't just be in the gang because it's like, just because it's like, nigga, nigga, bro. I'm not gonna call to no nigga to get a promotion, bro. Like, bro, I'm going to another nigga that's in the streets asking, oh yeah, can I get a promotion? Another nigga tell you to go slide on someone just because he above you. Hell no, bro. There's so many things. I'm like, I'm not a send-off gang. I can't listen to nobody.
Gangs were born out of necessity and were actually aiming to empower the poor and marginalized black youths who found strength in their numbers. The members of the gangs were often commonly discriminated against in their broader communities, and these gangs were often groups of people that had turned to crimes, ultimately to sustain themselves where the system had left them behind. Particularly during the 60s, amid rising civil rights movements, many of these early gangs were also increasingly political and often had militant approaches in trying to improve the conditions for Chicago's black communities, with some of these early gangs even receiving government grants to organize job trainings and other community programs. However, since the 70s, and particularly during the 80s and 90s, these organizations transformed from community groups to wide-reaching and well-organized corporate-style criminal organizations, with these big gangs specializing in large-scale drug trafficking and distribution operations. Now, this transformation of the gangs of Chicago over these decades was driven by several historical factors, but perhaps the most notable ones were the deindustrializations that had taken away hundreds of thousands of industrial jobs from Chicago's black and working class communities between the 70s and the 90s. This led to the so-called white flight, where many white Chicago residents moved away from the South and West Side neighborhoods between the 1950s and 1970s to suburbs on the outskirts of the city. This ultimately led to many of these gangs taking a grip of these predominantly black neighborhoods, with their control growing like never before. And this was further accelerated by the building of numerous extremely large public housing projects by the Chicago Housing Authority. Developments such as the Robert Taylor homes on the south side and the Cabrini Green homes in the north, these buildings provide...
Everybody know about Cabrini Green. Lots of y'all probably might not know about the Robert Taylor, but Cabrini Green, yeah, everybody know about that. Candyman was literally shot there, I believe.
Provided the gangs with the perfect headquarters from where they could handle their operations, with many of them controlling them with an iron fist, even going as far as to commonly keep snipers on the roofs of these buildings to protect the operations from rival gangs and the police. And lastly, to make matters even worse, throughout the 1980s and 1990s, we would see the nationwide epidemic tearing through these black communities enabled by these well-organized gangs. Actually arrived in Chicago slightly later than other large cities in America, but when it did come, it eventually brought an influx of demand to illegal drug markets. This created enormous profits for these well-organized gangs, allowing them to expand and strengthen their operations. This also led to violence among the gangs of this time, with these gangs battling it out in war of the streets to determine who would dominate these growing illegal drug markets. And this war was reflected in record-breaking homicide rates in Chicago between the 1970s and 1990s, which ultimately culminated to an all-time high in the early 90s of about 33 homicides per 100,000 people. At the time, it seemed that there was really no stopping these gangs as they grew and they spread out to many other Midwest and East Coast cities, infiltrating their black markets and spreading violence and devastation in their wake. But then something began happening at the turn of the millennium, and after decades of remarkable resilience, during the 2000s, these large and well-organized corporate-style gangs suddenly began breaking down incredibly quickly. Dr. Roberto Asfalm has actually studied the reasons behind this breakdown, listing three key developments. Firstly, while many of the gang leaders had been locked up in Illinois state prisons since the 1970s, this had arguably even strengthened their organizations, as gang representation in prisons actually allowed them the perfect environment for recruiting as well as forming contacts with other gangs, leading to large multi-gang alliances such as the Folk and People Nations. However, during the 1990s and 2000s, federal authorities began increasingly targeting these gangs, leading to numerous large-scale and high-profile indictments that sent top gang leaders to federal prisons where they had a much harder time maintaining the control of their organizations. This would cause a crisis of leadership amongst the gang members that were left in the streets. And to this day, two of the most infamous gang leaders...
It low-key probably made it worse, though, just locking them niggas up, because that's why I don't got no structure, because them niggas is locked up, you feel me? If them niggas was out, it probably wouldn't be as bad and, like, out of control as it is right now.
Larry Hoover of the Gangster Disciples and Jeff Fort of the Black P Stones remain incarcerated, being held at the infamous ADX Florence Supermax prison under brutal conditions with minimal human contact. And this just goes to show you how serious the authorities were about making examples of the people who founded and led America's most infamous gangs. But it wasn't just locking up the leaders that led to the collapse of the well-organized gangs of Chicago. Secondly, in the year 2000, the Chicago Housing Authority began a project titled the Plan for Transformation. This plan called for the demolition of almost all of the large public housing projects in Chicago, which had served as the primary locations for the city's most profitable and strategically protected drug marketplaces. And by the end of the 2000s, almost all of these projects had been demolished, and the former residents from them were completely displaced and spread out between various different neighborhoods. This disrupted the established gang territories and unsettled their long-standing order, as members of different gangs were now suddenly living in the same neighborhoods. These demolitions would also take down the so-called Randolph Towers, sometimes referred to as the Met Building, at 6217 South Calumet Avenue in 2006. These projects, which are still marked by an empty lot close to the modern-day Parkway Gardens, aka O-Block. This building used to be a Black disciple stronghold where many of the main characters of this story spent their early years, before their families dispersed to various different South Side neighborhoods, with 600 Breezy explaining to DJ Vlad in an interview how this transformation broke down the structure in their neighborhood, eventually causing the modern gang wars to spark up. This just goes to show you how the demolition of these project buildings in many ways was a symbolic demolition of the legacy of Chicago's gangs and their well-organized structures, as destroying these buildings pretty much destroyed the connection between many of the gang members and the leadership that were based there. This caused the young members to create completely new alliances that perhaps contradicted their former gang associations. But there would be another interesting factor that also changed Chicago's gang demographics. Lastly, the epidemic, which had provided increasing profits to the gangs and escalated their rivalries, largely ended towards the end of the 90s as the new generations increasingly shunned the drug that had destroyed their community and turned towards other less harmful and less profitable substances like Moreover, the large open-air drug markets that the gangs had been operating in their neighborhoods became increasingly unnecessary, as cell phones and the internet provided new technological ways for people to purchase drugs more easily and covertly, which in turn provided new opportunities for more small-scale suburban drug dealers, which actually took away drug revenues from the largely organized gangs that historically sold dope in poorer neighborhoods. Whilst open-air drug markets have to an extent survived on the west side of Chicago, they largely disappeared on the south side, creating a major hole in the profits of most of the gangs operating in these areas. And in the midst of the dwindling drug profits, fractured gang territories, and a leadership crisis, the younger gang members began to question the established systems and methods of their respective organizations, as well as their own roles within these hierarchies, as these young foot soldiers would be faced with the constant threat of arrest and physical harm in the streets, where they were risking their lives selling drugs and engaging in the escalating gang conflicts. The leaders of these gangs, who were often situated in secure suburban locations or distant state penitentiaries, often assumed relatively small risks in overseeing these new operations, with the kingpins still receiving the majority of the profits but taking very little of the risk. Collectively, these developments laid the foundations for uprisings within.
See, that's the best thing right there, being the kingpin, because you making the moolah, and you don't gotta take that risk like the other motherfuckers taking.
The gangs, which eventually shattered their organizational structures during the 2000s before drill music had even emerged. This was followed by individual gang members or small groups increasingly focusing on other ways to make money, such as robbery. This led to the start of what some people have called the stick-up era of the 2000s, which was perhaps most famously exemplified by a violent group of GDs, BDs, and other historic Chicago gang members who joined together under the name the Hobos, a testament to their lifestyle of simply sleeping and robbing. The Hobos cared more about simply taking from people than which historic gangs their members had a heritage in. But while the Hobos and other stick-up crews undoubtedly caused much fear and violence in the aftermath of Chicago's fractured gangland, overall the 2000s saw a significant downturn in Chicago's murder rate. And this was giving the city much-needed hope that things were beginning to turn better. But unfortunately, this would turn out just to be the calm before another storm, which would eventually raise the violence again to the levels of the mid-90s. But unlike the 90s, when gang wars revolved around strategic issues like control over drug markets or disputes over territory,
it's just mindless nigga kill nigga now. Oh, this nigga looked at me the wrong way. Oh, this nigga was born on this hood. Oh, he did.
the motives behind the modern-day gang conflicts seem much harder to pinpoint, with serious beef seemingly based on tit-for-tat revenge killings that played out over the years. The many murders and get-backs between these new generations of gangs have left generational traumas and grudges, creating a cycle of violence that seems impossible to stop, leaving gangs motivated to kill purely for revenge rather than being motivated by money like they were back in the day. And this is further exacerbated by the fact that there's now an astonishing number of small gang sets that live incredibly close to each other, commonly lacking any sort of real leadership structure that usually would assert control over the violence in the streets. This means that any interpersonal conflict between two members of different gang sets can at any point flame up into a full-blown war due to the ill-considered actions of just one or two people. Such conflicts have become increasingly likely in the age of social media that gang members commonly use to diss each other. Not to mention the music, where the taunting of rival gang sets and their murdered members often takes particularly aggressive and disrespectful.
We ain't gonna cap on Twitter. Twitter, if you want to see them talk about what they did, just go to Twitter and look at their feed, but they ass be saying all types of shit. I don't know if it's true or fake, but if it is true, they ass is tweaking.
Forms. In the 2010s, Chicago drill music would emerge, and drill music would not only give listeners a window into the criminal underworld in Chicago for the first time ever, but it would also give those members involved in the gang wars a megaphone to broadcast boastful accounts of their activities in the streets, with the songs constantly including insulting disses towards their opposition and murdered rivals. Now, whether or not you believe the music itself is fueling the gang wars, there's no denying that for those living in the gang-infested streets of Chicago, the music has become a notice board for local gangs to claim responsibility for the brazen murders that they've committed, taunting their ops in front of an audience of thousands, sometimes millions.
I honestly feel the music do play a part because these young niggas listen to that shit and self-consciously off them fucking drugs. That shit do be fucking up your head and make your ass want to do that shit.
The environment where the young members of 600 grew up and eventually made their names, both in the streets and in the city's newly booming music scene. And in the years that would follow, members of the newly formed street gang 600 would become infamous in the streets of Chicago, not just for the deadly violence they carried out in the streets, but also the brazen music they made, bragging about it for the whole world to hear.
All right, that's it. Shout out Trap Blue Rock Clips. We did 2 hours. We finna hop off live because we gotta do some other videos. Y'all be smooth.